Hi, I'm Nitya Sambasivan. I'm a researcher at Google Research, and my talk today is about reimagining algorithmic fairness for India and beyond. So, this research was done in collaboration with my colleagues Arnesen, Ben Hutchinson, Tulsi Doshi, and Vinod Kumar Prabhakaran. Conventional algorithmic fairness makes several assumptions based on Western institutions and infrastructures. For example, a successful outcome from fairness research, which is bans and moratoria on facial recognition, came from a concerted effort across ML fairness research, decades of scientific research focused on Western populations, public data sets, APIs, and information acts for researchers to analyze model outcomes, an ML industry and research community that's fairly responsive to bias reports, government representatives glued into technology, and an active media that systematically scrutinizes AI impacts. We argue that the assumptions about the relevance and efficacy of these factors can fail and even be harmful in much of the world. Fairness research, as of today, remains rooted in Western concerns and histories, with subgroups like race and gender, datasets like ImageNet, measurement scales like the Fitzpatrick scale, and legal tenets from civil laws that are used in fairness optimizations. However, conventional algorithmic fairness is increasingly espoused in AI policies in non Western countries like India, Tunisia, Uruguay, and more, without paying attention to local contexts. Without engagement with the conditions, values, politics, and histories of the non West, algorithmic fairness can be a tokenism at best, pernicious at worst for non Western communities. If algorithmic fairness is to serve as the ethical compass of AI, it is imperative that the field itself recognize its own defaults, biases, and blind spots to avoid perpetuating historical harms that we aim to mitigate. We must take pains not to develop a general theory of algorithmic fairness based on the study of Western populations alone. So we ask, could fairness have structurally different meanings in the non West? Could fairness frameworks that rely on Western infrastructures be counterproductive elsewhere? How do social, economic, and infrastructural factors influence fair ML? Our research contributes an analysis of end to end algorithmic power in India. We provide a starting roadmap for algorithmic fairness centered in India and an example of bottom up fairness analysis. To answer these questions, we focus on India, the world's largest democracy, a multi ethnic, multilingual, post colonial nation, and the world's second largest internet using population. Despite numerous high stakes AI deployments, such as in predictive policing and welfare disbursements, there is no substantial responsible AI research or formal tech policy in India as of today. We used a combination of expert interviews and discourse analysis of emerging algorithmic deployments as our data. Our methods were chosen in order to provide an expansive account of who is building ML for whom, what the various on the ground experiences are, what the various processes of unfairness and exclusions are, and how they relate to social justice. Our interviews were conducted with scholars, activists, and practitioners working with marginalized communities in the grassroots across law and policy, journalism, computer science, social sciences, and more. And we combined this data with a systematic analysis of emerging algorithmic deployments in India for the past 11 years since the introduction of Aadhaar, the unique ID system. We analyze our data using South Asian feminist, decolonial, and anti-caste lenses. A South Asian feminist stance, which is a critique of white Western feminism that saw non-Western women as powerless victims that needed rescuing by the West, allows us to examine oppressed communities in India as encountering and subverting forces of power while locating in contextual specifics of family, caste, class, and religion. Caste, for those who aren't aware, is an endogamous, ranked social identity assigned at birth, which can determine life opportunities, including personal rights, freedom, dignity, livelihood, and political participation. Following Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's insight on how caste hierarchies and patriarchies are linked in India, we echo that no social justice commitment in India can take place without examining caste, gender, and religion. A decolonial perspective helps us confront inequities from colonization in India, providing new openings for knowledge and justice. On to the findings. One of our key arguments is that the distance between models and disempowered communities that we hope to serve in India is large. This is because of technical distance, social distance, ethical distance, temporal distance, and physical distance. Hence, a myopic focus on localizing fair model outputs alone can simply backfire. We point to three themes that challenge existing assumptions in algorithmic fairness in India, starting with data and model distortions. Biases in models are often attributed to biased data sets, and there's a notion of fixing the data to fix the bias. Social contracts and infrastructures in India challenge the assumption that data sets are faithful representations of people and phenomena. Data can often be missing in the form of digital divide, where half of the country does not have access to the internet, and this excluded half is primarily women, rural communities, and Adivasis, who are the indigenous tribes of South Asia. Now, this was especially evident in the rollout of the contact tracing app, which could only be used by half of the country. Data can also be missing due to class, gender, and caste inequities in accessing and creating online content. And as a result, any digital data is a representation of the privileged. Off data practices are common in India, which can happen outside of the network, say through phone calls, which may not count as a data point. Data can be missing due to artful user practices to manipulate algorithms, which may be motivated by needs around privacy, abuse, or reputation. Socioeconomic and demographic data at the national, state, and municipal levels is frequently unavailable to the public and for research. The state and industry apparatus collect and retain large-scale data, but the data sets are not always made publicly available, especially those featuring migration, incarceration, unemployment, or education, divided by different subgroups. A rich human infrastructure from India's public service delivery, such as frontline data for health workers, extends into AI data collection. However, they face disproportionate work burden, sometimes leading to data collection errors. Now, consent to a data worker stems from high interpersonal trust and holding them in high respect, relationships which may not be transitive to downstream AI applications. Statistical fairness makes a critical assumption so pervasively that is rarely even stated, that user data corresponds one-to-one to an individual person in the real world. Now, this gets challenged in India through shared device usage and the use of multiple SIM cards, the frequency with which people change their numbers. And location may not be permanent or tethered to the home in the case of, for example, migrant workers who travel across porous state boundaries. Proxies in India may be similar to the West, but may have different implementation nuances. A name is the most semantically meaningful proxy in India, which can communicate caste, gender, religion, class, or ethnicity. Zip codes in India are rather heterogeneous, with slum housing and posh housing abutting each other in urban cities, unlike in the West, which may have a history of redlining in certain neighborhoods. Mobility is much lower for women due to safety concerns, and for people with disabilities due to limited infrastructure like ramps. Traditional occupations may correspond to caste or religion. However, AI systems in India remain underanalyzed for biases, which mirrors the limited public discourse on oppression, say in contrast to the discourse on anti-racism in the United States. AI models in India are often overfitted to good data profiles of the digitally rich, privileged communities. These are typically subgroups that have access to underlying variables for data richness, like money, mobility, or literacy, which is typically held by middle class men. For example, popular lending apps equate good credit with whether the user calls their parents daily, have stored over 58 contacts, played car racing games, and could repay the loan in 30 days, many of which correspond to middle class men, even though there's decades of microfinance research showing that women have high loan repayment rates. So women often end up taking loans in the names of men because of the perception of better credit scores for men in AI models. Model retraining can leave new room for bias due to a lack of fair ML standards in India. Example, a facial recognition service used by police stations in 8 states in India retrained a Western facial recognition model on photos of Bollywood and regional film stars to mitigate the bias. Perfectly fine, but Indian film stars are overwhelmingly fair skinned, conventionally attractive, and able bodied, and not fully representative of the larger society. Indic justice models like reservations or quotas for redistribution of resources that are constitutionally enshrined for oppressed castes, religion, gender, persons with disabilities, and more offer new models for fairness optimizations, extending and challenging current techniques like equal opportunity or equal odds. Moving on to double standards and distance from ML makers. AI developers, both private and the state, tend to treat Indians user communities as bottom billion petri dishes for models, subjecting them to intrusive models, non consensual automation, poor tech policies, inadequate research, and low standard free products. Whereas industry and research is somewhat responsive to user bias reports in the West, recourse and agency of Indian users, especially those disempowered by caste, religion, or gender, are poorly addressed in AI. When recourse does exist, it can often be culturally insensitive or dehumanizing. AI systems often remove street level bureaucrats and administrative officers who these are the human infrastructures who play a crucial role in providing recourse to marginalized Indian communities. The high-tech illegibility of AI renders recourse out of reach for groups marginalized by literacy, legal, or educational capital. Dalit and Muslim bodies are often increasingly used as test subjects for AI surveillance. Example, how human efficiency trackers are deployed among Dalit sanitation workers, and these are equipped with microphones, GPS, cameras, and a SIM card, leading to women workers avoiding restrooms for the fear of camera capture or waiting for the tracker to die before going home. While India has a thriving tech industry and a software computer science education sector, a large majority of this workforce is in the less influential low level AI labor, such as data annotation and outsourcing services, limiting the ability to substantially remediate the distances. The minority engineers and company founders come primarily from privileged caste and class backgrounds. Many, though not all, graduates of the IITs, founders of pioneering Indian software companies, and nearly all Nobel Prize winners of Indian origin have come from privileged caste and class backgrounds. And this further amplifies distances with oppressed communities. Finally, unquestioning AI aspiration. The AI imaginary is aspirational in India, often rooted in hype and promise. AI solutions are readily adopted in high stakes domains, often too early. For example, the facial recognition system used by the Delhi police has been known to have 2% accuracy and cannot distinguish between boy and girl children, as stated in court, and was used to arrest over 1,000 protesters in January 2020. For reference, a confidence threshold of 80 to 95% is recommended for AI in law enforcement. The official statement was, this is a software. It does not see faith. It does not see clothes. It only sees the face, and through the face the person is caught. Now, while algorithms may not be trained on subgroups, proxies may correspond to Dalits, Adivasis, and Muslims disproportionately. Example, how under trials in prisons largely come from these backgrounds. Emerging AI for good deployments tend to leave out minorities in some cases. For example, how AI is often justified in the public domain as surveillance for smart cities for women's safety measures, but tend to invisibilize transgender members or increase the monitoring of Dalit and Muslim areas. Take the example of a facial recognition system deployed outside women's restrooms to detect intrusion by non female entrants, which potentially leads to violence against transgender members. Automation solutions are sometimes announced following public sentiment, but often turned into surveillance. Example, how predictive policing in Delhi was announced after Nirbhaya's gruesome gang rape in 2012. AI solutions in India have end to end opacity Now, this is in contrast to the model explainability or the interpretability issue, where the developer or the user tries to gain an understanding of how the model came up with the inferences that it did. In contrast, AI solutions in India have end-to-end opacity with problem statement, data sets, and model inferences. India lacks an effective ecosystem of tools, policies, and processes to help stakeholders interrogate AI solutions, which is a major impediment in ensuring meaningful fairness. Algorithmic fairness requires a buffer zone of journalists, activists, and researchers to keep AI system builders accountable. Tech journalism in India today appears to cover app launches and tech business deals and is less focused on scrutinizing algorithms and their impacts. Now, journalism is also comprised of privileged caste members, invisibilizing the vast oppressed majority in public discourse. We extend the spirit of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's call to action. There cannot be political reform without social reform. A fair ML strategy for India needs to reflect its deeply plural, complex, and contradictory nature and needs to go beyond model fairness. We call upon fairness researchers working in India to engage with end-to-end factors impacting algorithms in India, including how AI is conceived, produced, utilized, appropriated, assessed, and contested in India. We humbly submit that these are large, open-ended challenges that have perhaps not received much focus or are considered large in scope. The pathways we present are opportunities for cross-disciplinary and cross-institutional collaboration. We call for action along three critical and contingent pathways as a starting point for fairness in India: recontextualizing, empowering, and enabling. Now, due to the model and data distortions in India, we must be careful with data until they are trustworthy and combine data sets with an understanding of context. The vibrant human infrastructures point to new ways of looking at data as dialogue. Such data gathering via community relationships leads us to view data records as products of both the beholder and the beheld. This leads to new questions on social audits, new forms of transitive consent, and data equity. Categories, ontologies, and behaviors are context specific and need to be questioned. Recontextualizing models is non trivial. For example, as names can act as a signifier for various socio-demographic attributes in India, but they may not be readily available name datasets. The axes of discrimination we list could be a starting point to detect and mitigate unfairness issues in models. Fairness criteria should be adopted to the social justice mechanisms appropriate to context. Empowering communities. How can we move from the common good defined by the researcher, the supposedly all-knowing entity who has the experience and the expertise to identify what is of benefit to all? Humbly creating grassroots commitments with vulnerable communities is a first step. Marginalized communities need to be empowered in identifying problems, specifying fairness expectations, and designing systems to avoid top-down fairness. India's heterogeneity means that fair ML researchers' commitment should go beyond model outputs to creating accessible systems. And we can learn from computing cousins like ICTD, where constraints are treated as design material, resulting in delay-tolerant connectivity, low-cost devices, capacity building, and more. Critiques are raised in our study on how neoliberal AI follows a broader pattern of extraction from bottom billion data subjects. Like the fatal Union Carbide gas leak in 1984, unequal standards, inadequate safeguards, and dubious applications of AI in the non-West can lead to catastrophic effects. For fair ML to be impactful and sustainable, it's crucial for researchers to enable a critically conscious fair ML ecosystem through solidarity with various partners. Context matters. We show how algorithmic fairness assumptions are challenged in the Indian context. We must take care not to copy-paste the Western normative ML fairness everywhere. Borrowing from Escobar, we must evolve pluriverses of AI ethics to flourish. We call for considerations that are certainly not limited to India and likewise for evolving global approaches to fair ML. Thank you.